Welcome back to A History of Feminism for Gamers, Part 2, the first wave. Yes, it's very confusing that the first wave is Part 2. The waves of feminism are a bit like Galaga. You get a bunch of targets, you have a chance to hit, but you probably won't get them all, so you have to keep shooting at the ones you missed while another wave descends on you. The defining issue of first wave feminism was the right for women to vote, also known as voting franchise or suffrage. Though first wave feminism in retrospect seems the most cut and dried, that's just the mists of time creating an illusion. It had many internal conflicts, and many at the time saw it as a wretched hive of radicals, some violent. In fact, there's so much to cover here, I had to split it into two parts. Women such as Christine de Pizan has been writing about womanhood since the 15th century. One could even claim that this tradition goes all the way back to the ancient Greek poet Sappho. But a few women writing in isolation centuries apart can't be said to be a movement. We have millennia of writing produced by men and for men, and a much shorter, fragmented history of well-circulated writing of women. All monotheistic religious texts are written not just by men, but for men, which is why there are all the references to lying with thy neighbor's wife and men lying with men, and yet there are no direct prohibitions against women lying with women. Women in those societies were treated as the property of the men in their lives. They couldn't own land, couldn't vote, and couldn't provide for their children on their own through socially acceptable means. They didn't, quote, need rules and laws because the rules were whatever the dominant man said they were. This is the patriarchy that feminists talk about that makes people cringe. The thing is, it's a historically documented phenomenon that has influenced all the classic works of literature that were taught in school. Women weren't even allowed to perform female characters in Shakespeare's day, at a time when England itself was ruled by Queen Elizabeth I. Acting was seen as too public a role for women. Even attending the theater was seen as too public for women by some, though many women did it. Back then, the idea was that the mere presence of a woman would incite lewd behavior from men, an idea that's continued on to this day in many rigidly traditionalist communities. And let's face it, the idea that the image of a naked woman is somehow inherently sinful is tied to the idea that the behavior, concentration, and comfort of men is the priority in polite society. Women aren't seen to become uncontrollable balls of lust when confronted by a professional wrestler in little more than underwear. Is this the fault of men in society? No, but it's real. Because of this historical reality, the traditions of medievalist literature sideline women and make it a challenge for makers of historical video games to include women without defying realism. So often they put them in the only way women were present in any real public way: prostitutes. But prominent feminists in gaming complained about the mere presence of prostitutes in video games, dismissing them as background decoration. Being in the background was a step up for many women in Elizabethan times, when they were expected to not be seen at all. This idea is critical to Virginia Woolf's profoundly feminist novel Orlando. Yes, I'm sneaking in recommended reading to those who are interested. It isn't random that Woolf's gender-bending protagonist was a favorite page of the perpetually unmarried Queen Elizabeth. Woolf seemed to take great glee in undermining the virginity narrative of the retroactively sainted queen. So what's the result of this tension facing game developers? Women weren't visible in the settings of many popular fictional periods, but if you include them in the way they were visible, you're accused of sexism. Well, game makers are forced to rewrite the rulebook and create fictional roles for women, only to be told they're not going far enough. See BioWare and Ubisoft's long fight with the political correctness police. By the year 1800, the average married woman had 7 children. They had no access to higher education except in some exceptional circumstances, couldn't own property, and though lower class women worked, their fathers and husbands controlled whatever money they made. And as strange as this might seem today, religion was beginning to play a role in changing all that, thanks to the religious protections produced by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1791. The Second Great Awakening swept through America until 1830. The Second Great Awakening produced large public religious revivals, some as large as 20,000 people. They featured sermons heavy on public participation and huge demonstrative outpourings of emotion in the Methodist and Baptist traditions. These revivals led to a large number of conversions, in part because of their egalitarian sentiments. The important thing to the evangelicals of early America was the strength of your faith, not social hierarchy. Even the ministers didn't need formal training. There was a populist belief that people could change their circumstances for the better. The emphasis on public demonstration led to more public roles for women, at least white women. Women took up prominent roles in the abolitionist and temperance movements. Women began writing and speaking about their desire for greater equality. Things built until 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention is the point many people mark as the official beginning of first-wave feminism in North America. The Seneca Falls Convention was America's first women's rights convention. Inspired by previous anti-slavery rallies, the Seneca Falls Convention produced a declaration of sentiments that included grievances against women's inability to keep the money they earned, own property, vote, get a college education, or even be seen as morally culpable under the law if a woman committed a crime with her husband. Interestingly, some grievances from the Seneca Falls Convention persist at least partially to this day. Women can't be members of the clergy in certain religions, and women are marginalized in society due to certain moral transgressions that men are permitted with impunity. It seems like the only thing the right and left wings of politics can agree on these days is that naked ladies are bad, but naked men are a sign of virility. Why else would male politicians all over the world deliberately be photographed shirtless? We collectively perpetuate this double standard regarding nudity, and many of us don't question it. But early feminists were already pointing out that these double standards gave women second-class status. We see that in video games today, where male characters can run around half-naked with impunity, but oh god, boobs! And in video game communities, another particular grievance from the Seneca Falls Convention is still having impacts. Quote, "He has made her morally an irresponsible being, as she can commit many crimes with impunity, provided they be done in the presence of her husband." This is still somewhat true. In 2012, a study found that men receive 63% longer prison sentences than women do for the same crimes. Men are also more likely to go to prison at all if convicted than women. There's been a lot written about women crime, and I'll try to distill it down to something that's easily digestible. Put as simply as I can, women are more likely to be found guilty of moral transgressions, especially regarding sexual morality, but less likely to be seen as criminally culpable. Black women are apparently especially likely to be seen as unable to help their criminality. The idea that there is just a weakness inside them linked to some sort of failure to build relationships in a heteronormative paradigm. In other words, we still to this day function on the idea that men set and control moral standards for women, so women are considered less morally at fault for violating those standards. Is this the fault of men? No, it's something all of society does. This societal double standard is causing huge amounts of conflict in video game communities. Gendered sexual slurs are thrown around too liberally, as they are everywhere on the internet. But women who speak about games seem to have lower requirements for intellectual and ethical accountability. I'm not going to name specific cases here because that'll just start a you-know-what storm. But I'm sure you can recall cases where a woman shot her mouth off about video games, was completely dead wrong, but any criticism was equated with harassment. This may seem like a double standard that benefits women in the short term, but in the long term, it seriously holds us back because it's rooted in the persistent idea that women are emotionally and morally inferior to men, and men must still act as behavioral gatekeepers when women are involved. Look, no one likes being criticized, but we can't have one set of rules for men in gaming debates and another set of rules for women. It can't be okay to threaten and insult a man, but not a woman. Underlying all this strange modern digital chivalric code is the concept that women can't be expected to be as inherently emotionally tough as men. That's garbage. These were precisely the things first-wave feminists wanted changed. The complete hypocrisy of the perception in the 1800s of women as a fragile, weaker sex was that this belief only applied to white women. Sojourner Truth pointed out in 1851 that the treatment of black women was notably different than that of white women, prompting her to ask, "Ain't I a woman?" Truth pointed out that white men believed white women needed a lot more help doing physical tasks than they actually did, proven by the fact that black women were expected to get their own damn selves into carriages and over puddles. Sojourner Truth understood the inherent condescension in treating women like we're made of glass. Black women were apparently quite capable of work. Society was a collection of excuses to explain restricting the human rights of anyone who wasn't a white man. The alleged inherent supremacy of the white man was used to explain all inequalities as being inflicted for the good of the oppressed person. Black people were too wild and white women were too hysterical to be left to their own devices. It probably seems strange, since some of these issues persist to this day, that these weren't the most contentious issues raised in the Seneca Falls Convention Declaration. The thing that made everyone spill their spaghetti was the assertion that women were being subjected to taxation without representation. Women's wages were taxed, but they weren't allowed to vote. That's pretty straightforward, cut and dried taxation without representation. Except back then, the logic was far less clear. The assumption was that white men were the only people capable of handling the stress of voting. Women were seen as extensions of their fathers until marriage, when they transferred to extensions of their husbands. They were being represented, the theory went, by men. At the Seneca Falls Convention, there was an additional wrinkle. The elective franchise issue was controversial because the attendees were predominantly Quaker, and Quaker men often refused the right to vote themselves. But they got it passed, only for their grievances to be met with ridicule and criticism by the press. Part of the reason that the press is so yay women's rights now is that it has a lousy historical track record regarding being on the progressive side of that issue. We'll get to that more when we talk about the second wave. By the time the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote all across the United States in 1920, only one of the female attendees of the Seneca Falls Convention was still alive. Unfortunately, Charlotte Woodard Pierce, who had been 19 years old at the time of the convention, was now 92 years old and too ill to cast a ballot. Suffrage was the predominant issue of first-wave feminism. You've probably heard the term suffragist or suffragette, and back then, it was important not to mix those terms up. American suffragists considered the term suffragette to be a slur. The British suffragettes were seen as more militant, and the Americans didn't identify with that. Even in the first wave of feminism, there were divisions, and one of those lines were drawn on the concept of ladylike conduct. While suffrage and first wave feminism are seen today as the same thing, not all suffragists adopted the term feminism, which had crossed over from France. A suffragist who was not a feminist advocated for voting rights, but only voting rights. She wasn't interested in complete equality with men. Other working class women were more interested in general working conditions than the right to vote. First wave feminism was far from a monolith. Part 2 of our examination of first wave feminism for gamers will look at the violent militancy, some would even say terrorism, of the suffragettes. That's next week. Thanks for watching.